Picture this. It's 1885 in the harsh Colorado wilderness. A lone cowboy rides through the desolate plains, carrying the weight of unspeakable loss. His family, murdered by ruthless bandits 3 years ago. His heart, locked away like a fortress, never to love again. Or so he thought. But fate has a way of changing everything in an instant. When Jake Sullivan hears a desperate whimper coming from a chained wagon abandoned in the middle of nowhere, he has no idea that breaking that lock will shatter the walls around his heart forever. Inside that wagon, he finds Sarah, a young woman whose own brother traded her away like livestock. Sold for a cow and $50. Destined for a life of unspeakable horror in Denver's darkest corners. What happens next will restore your faith in human kindness and prove that sometimes the most unlikely people become our chosen family. This is a story of survival, redemption, and love found in the most unexpected places. But here's what I need from you before we begin Sarah and Jake's incredible journey together. If stories like this touch your heart, if you believe in the power of human connection and second chances, then please hit that subscribe button right now. Your support means everything to creators like me who pour our hearts into bringing you these emotional stories. And don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. It helps more people discover these powerful tales. Finally, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had someone unexpectedly change your life? Share your story with our community. Now, let's dive into Chapter 1 and discover how a cowboy's act of kindness sparked a love story that would change two broken souls forever. The late afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Colorado plains, its golden rays creating a shimmering haze that danced across the endless expanse of sagebrush and rocky outcroppings. Jake Sullivan pulled his weathered leather hat lower over his eyes, feeling the familiar sting of dust and wind against his sun-darkened face. His horse, a sturdy chestnut mare named Belle, picked her way carefully along the deeply rutted trail that wound its way toward Denver, her hooves raising small clouds of dust with each measured step. The October air carried the crisp promise of winter, mixed with the earthy scent of sage and the distant threat of rain that hung heavy in the darkening clouds gathering on the horizon. Jake had been riding for 3 days straight, stopping only to rest Belle and catch a few hours of restless sleep under the vast canopy of stars. The solitude had suited him for the past 5 years, ever since the night his world crumbled into ash and blood. At 32, Jake Sullivan was a man carved from granite and grief. His tall frame sat easy in the saddle, muscles honed by years of hard work and harder living. His hands, scarred from countless hours of rope work and broken horses, rested lightly on the reins, but his steel-gray eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. In this unforgiving territory, letting your guard down for even a moment could mean the difference between seeing another sunrise and becoming food for the buzzards. The memory of his wife Martha's laugh, bright and musical as church bells on a Sunday morning, still echoed in his mind during the quiet moments. She'd been hanging laundry on the line behind their little ranch house when the Garrett gang rode up that terrible November evening. Tommy, barely 5 years old, had been playing with his wooden horses in the dirt nearby, making soft neighing sounds as he galloped them across imaginary plains. Jake had been in town, selling cattle and buying supplies for the coming winter. By the time he'd returned home, following the orange glow visible for miles across the darkening prairie, there was nothing left but smoldering ruins and 2 graves he'd dug with his own hands under the cottonwood tree where Martha had dreamed of watching their grandchildren play someday. The sound of creaking would cut through his dark memories like a blade. Jake reined Belle to a stop, his hand instinctively moving to rest on the grip of his Colt .45. Ahead, partially concealed behind a cluster of weathered granite boulders that jutted up from the prairie like ancient tombstones, sat a canvas-covered wagon. Its cover flapped and snapped in the wind with an irregular rhythm that made Belle's ears twitch nervously. Something wasn't right. Jake had seen plenty of abandoned wagons in his travels. Victims of Indian raids, mechanical failures, or simply families who'd run out of money and hope. But this wagon looked different. Too clean, too intact. And there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. As he guided Belle closer, keeping his movements slow and deliberate, Jake's experienced eyes took in every detail. The wagon's wooden sides were scarred but solid, its iron-rimmed wheels still true. The canvas cover, though torn in places, was relatively new. But what caught his attention most was the heavy chain wrapped around the tailgate, secured with a brass padlock that gleamed in the afternoon sun. Who chains cargo in from the outside? Jake had hauled everything from cattle to mining equipment across these plains, and he'd never seen a wagon locked up like a jail cell. That's when he heard it, a sound so soft he almost missed it over the whistle of wind through the rocks. A whimper, barely human, filled with such desperation that it made his chest tighten with recognition. It was the sound of someone who had given up hope but couldn't quite stop hoping. Jake dismounted slowly, his spurs chiming against the rocky ground. Belle snorted and tossed her head, sensing his tension. He laid a calming hand on her neck, feeling her warmth and the steady rhythm of her breathing. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from days of silence. "Let's see what we've got here." The wagon's tailgate was secured with a length of heavy chain wrapped multiple times around the wooden posts, the brass padlock hanging like a golden eye in the center. Jake examined it closely, noting the fresh scratches around the keyhole and the way the metal still held traces of oil. This lock had been installed recently, and by someone who knew what they were doing. "Hello," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the empty landscape. "Is someone in there?" The whimpering stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of someone moving very carefully, as if afraid that even the slightest noise might bring terrible consequences. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough cruelty in his life to recognize the sound of real fear. "I'm not going to hurt you," Jake said, his tone gentler now, the way he used to speak to Martha when she had nightmares about her childhood. "My name's Jake Sullivan. I'm just a traveler passing through." For a long moment, there was only the sound of wind and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then, so quietly he had to strain to hear it, came a voice that made his blood run cold. Please don't tell my brother you found me." The voice was young, female, and filled with such terror that Jake felt his vision blur with sudden rage. He'd heard that same desperate fear in his wife's voice during the nightmares that had haunted her sleep, remnants of her own childhood trauma. Without hesitation, he drew his Colt .45 and aimed it at the brass padlock. The gunshot cracked across the prairie like thunder, sending a pair of ravens exploding from their perch on a nearby boulder. The lock shattered, pieces of brass and steel scattering across the rocky ground. The heavy chain fell away with a metallic clatter that seemed to echo forever in the vast emptiness. Jake holstered his weapon and approached the wagon's tailgate with careful steps. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the canvas cover, not from fear but from the terrible certainty that whatever he found inside would change everything. He'd learned long ago that some moments divided your life into before and after, and he could feel one of those moments approaching like a storm front. When he pulled back the canvas cover, Jake's breath caught in his throat. Huddled in the far corner of the wagon bed, pressed against the wooden slats like a cornered animal, was a young woman who looked like she'd been through hell and hadn't quite made it back yet. She was perhaps 22 or 23, with auburn hair that caught the light like burnished copper despite being matted and tangled around her face. Her dress, once a soft blue calico, was now torn and stained with dirt and what looked like dried blood. Her wrists bore the angry red marks of rope burns, and her green eyes that should have been bright with youth and hope, were wide with the kind of terror that came from being betrayed by the very people who should have protected her. "Dear God," Jake whispered, holstering his weapon with movements that felt strangely distant and unreal. "What happened to you?" The woman shrank back against the wagon's side, her body trembling like a leaf in a windstorm. She was so thin Jake could see the sharp angles of her collarbones above the torn neckline of her dress. Her lips were cracked and pale, and when she spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. You're not with Edmund?" "Edmund?" Jake kept his voice calm and non-threatening, the way he'd learned to speak to injured animals. "Is that your brother?" She nodded, and tears began to stream down her dirt-streaked cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the grime. "He traded me to Mr. Garrett for a cow and $50. Mr. Garrett said he'd come back for me, but that was 3 days ago. Maybe 4. I've lost track of time." Jake felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same white-hot fury he'd felt the night he'd found his family's bodies. But this time, he forced himself to stay calm. This woman needed help, not his anger. She needed someone to be gentle with her, to show her that not all men were monsters. "What's your name?" he asked, extending his hand toward her, palm up, the way he'd approach a frightened horse. "Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Sarah Mitchell," Jake said, his voice steady and warm, "you're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore. Let me help you out of there." Sarah stared at his outstretched hand as if it might be a snake ready to strike. Jake could see the internal struggle playing out across her face, the desperate need for help warring with the fear of trusting another man. Her green eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of deception or cruelty. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were ice cold despite the warmth of the afternoon, and Jake could feel the tremor that ran through her entire body. As Jake helped her climb down from the wagon, he noticed how thin she was, how her hands shook from hunger and exhaustion. Her legs seemed barely able to support her weight, and when her feet touched the ground, her knees buckled. Jake caught her before she could fall, his arms steady and strong around her fragile frame. "Easy there," Jake said, his voice gentle as he helped her stand. "When did you last eat something?" Sarah looked up at him with confusion, as if the question was in a foreign language. I don't remember," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "There was some water in a canteen, but no food. I think they forgot about me." Jake looked around the desolate landscape, then back at Sarah's frightened face. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to take her to the nearest town, hand her over to the law, and continue on his way. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's problems usually led to nothing but pain. But something in her eyes, a haunted look he recognized from his own mirror during those first terrible months after Martha and Tommy's deaths, made him pause. This woman had been betrayed by the person who should have protected her most. She'd been treated like property, like something to be bought and sold. And now she was looking at him with the same desperate hope he'd once felt, the hope that someone, somewhere, might show her a kindness she no longer believed she deserved. "Listen, Sarah," Jake said, his decision made before he'd even finished the thought. "I've got supplies, food, water. My camp's not far from here. You can rest, get your strength back, and we'll figure out what to do next." Sarah looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of deception. In her world, men who offered help always wanted something in return, and that something was usually more than she was willing to give. "Why would you help me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't even know me." Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun dip lower toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, he could see storm clouds gathering, promising rain before morning. But for now, the world was caught in that magical time between day and night, when anything seemed possible. "Because everybody deserves a chance to be free," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of his own hard-won wisdom. "And because leaving you here isn't something I could live with." As Jake helped Sarah onto Belle's back, settling her gently in front of him, and gathered what supplies he could from the abandoned wagon, neither of them noticed the lone rider watching from the ridge above. The man sat motionless on his horse, his face hidden in the shadow of his hat brim, studying the scene below with calculating eyes. After several minutes, the watcher turned his horse and rode hard toward the east, kicking up a cloud of dust that dissipated quickly in the growing wind. But his message would reach its destination long before Jake and Sarah found safety, and the wheels of fate were already turning, setting in motion events that would test them both in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As they rode toward Jake's camp, Sarah's exhausted body leaning against his chest, Jake found himself wondering what he'd gotten himself into. But when he looked down at the young woman who'd been literally thrown away by her own family, he knew he'd made the right choice. Sometimes, in a world full of cruelty and indifference, the most revolutionary act was simply being kind. Jake's camp was a simple affair. A small fire ring surrounded by rocks, his bedroll spread near a cluster of juniper trees, and his supplies organized with military precision. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jake heated beans and coffee over the flickering flames while Sarah sat wrapped in his spare blanket, staring into the fire. "You don't have to tell me everything," Jake said, stirring the beans. "But if we're going to travel together, I need to know what we're up against." Sarah pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The warmth of the fire was the first comfort she'd felt in days, but the memories still cut deep. "My parents died last spring. Fever took them both within a week. Edmund inherited the farm, but he was never good with money or planning. By September, we were down to our last few dollars." Jake handed her a tin plate of beans and hardtack. "Eat slow," he cautioned. "Your stomach needs time to adjust." Sarah nodded, taking small bites. The food was plain but warm, and she felt tears of gratitude threatening to spill over. Edmund said he had a solution. Said he'd met a man named Garrett who was willing to help us out of our troubles. I should have known it was too good to be true. "This Garrett, he's the one who took you?" "He came to the farm with 2 other men. Big men with guns. Edmund called me into the parlor and told me I was going with them. Said it was temporary, just until he could get back on his feet. But I heard him talking to Garrett later. He traded me for a cow and $50. Jake's jaw clenched, but he kept his voice steady. "Your own brother. He said I was a burden anyway. That I ate too much, contributed too little. Maybe he was right." "No," Jake said firmly, meeting her eyes across the fire. "No person is a burden, Sarah. What your brother did was wrong, and it says nothing about your worth." Sarah looked at him with surprise. In her world, women were often seen as commodities, especially unmarried women with no family to protect them. Jake's words carried a conviction that made her want to believe him. "Where were they taking you?" Jake asked. "Denver, I think. Garrett mentioned a house there where I'd be useful." Sarah's voice faltered, and Jake didn't need her to elaborate. He'd heard stories of such places, where desperate men sold vulnerable women to satisfy the appetites of others. "Well, you're not going to Denver," Jake said. "Not unless you want to." "But where can I go? Edmund won't take me back, and I have no money, no skills beyond keeping house and tending a garden." Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling up into the darkening sky. "There are towns out here always looking for teachers, seamstresses, cooks. Places where a woman can make her own way if she's got the courage for it." "And you'd help me get there?" "I'd see you safe," Jake promised. "It's what any decent man would do." Sarah studied his profile in the firelight. "You're not like other men I've known." Jake was quiet for a long moment. "I had a wife once. She was strong, independent, never afraid to speak her mind. She taught me that a woman's worth isn't measured by her usefulness to men, but by her own dreams and desires." "What happened to her?" The pain that crossed Jake's face was so raw that Sarah immediately regretted asking. "She was killed," he said simply, "along with our son. 3 years ago." "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have." "It's all right," Jake interrupted. "It's part of who I am now. The loss, the anger, the loneliness. But maybe helping you helps me remember who I used to be." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the crackling of the fire and the distant call of a coyote. Sarah found herself studying Jake's face, noting the lines of grief around his eyes, the way his hands remained steady despite the pain he carried. "Jake," she said finally, "why do you think my brother could do such a thing?" Jake considered the question carefully. "Fear makes people do terrible things. Desperation even more so. But that doesn't excuse what he did to you." "He used to be different," Sarah said softly. "Before our parents died, before the farm started failing. He was kinder then." "Maybe he was. But the man who traded his sister for livestock isn't the man you remember. That man is gone, Sarah. You need to grieve him and move on." Sarah nodded, understanding the truth in his words even as they hurt. "Where will you go after you help me?" "I don't know," Jake admitted. "I've been drifting for years, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Maybe it's time I found a place to belong again." "Maybe we both need to find where we belong," Sarah said quietly. Jake looked at her across the fire, seeing not just the frightened woman he'd rescued, but someone who understood loss and resilience. "Maybe we do." As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Jake showed Sarah how to bank the coals and arranged their sleeping areas a respectful distance apart. But as Sarah lay wrapped in Jake's blanket, staring up at the vast canopy of stars, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Neither of them slept deeply, both listening for sounds of approaching horses, both aware that their journey together was just beginning and that the road ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Jake heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching from the east. He was instantly alert, his hand moving to his sidearm as he gently shook Sarah awake. "Get up," he whispered urgently. "We've got company." Sarah's eyes flew open, and she immediately began gathering their supplies with practiced efficiency. The fear in her movements told Jake she'd been expecting this moment. 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their horses lathered with sweat from hard riding. Jake recognized the type immediately: hired guns, the kind of men who did dirty work for money and asked no questions about right or wrong. The lead rider was a tall man with a carefully groomed beard and expensive clothes that marked him as different from his companions. This had to be Garrett, the man who'd arranged Sarah's purchase. His eyes swept the campsite with calculated precision before settling on Sarah. "Miss Mitchell," Garrett called out, his voice carrying a false charm that made Jake's skin crawl. "You've caused us quite a bit of trouble. Your brother is very concerned about you." "I'll bet he is," Jake said, stepping between Garrett and Sarah. "Especially since he's lost his investment." Garrett's smile never wavered, but his eyes turned cold. "Mr. Sullivan, isn't it? I'm afraid you've involved yourself in a private family matter. Miss Mitchell belongs with us." "She doesn't belong to anyone," Jake replied, his hand resting on his gun grip. "And she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." "I'm afraid that's not your decision to make," Garrett said, signaling to his men. "Edmund Mitchell signed a legal contract transferring custody of his sister to me. I have the document right here." Garrett produced a folded paper from his jacket pocket. Everything was done according to territorial law. "Miss Mitchell is coming with us." Sarah moved closer to Jake, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's right about the law. A woman can't override her male relative's decisions about her custody." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough corrupt lawmen and twisted legal documents to know that Garrett was probably telling the truth, at least technically. But that didn't make it right. "Show me this contract," Jake demanded. Garrett nudged his horse forward, holding out the document. As Jake reached for it, one of Garrett's men drew his gun. But Jake was faster, his Colt clearing leather in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice. "I wouldn't," Jake said calmly, his weapon trained on Garrett. "Your boy there moves another muscle, and you'll be the first to meet your maker." The tension stretched taut between them, for men with guns drawn and Sarah caught in the middle. Jake's mind raced, calculating angles and distances, knowing that if shooting started, Sarah could be hurt in the crossfire. "This is foolish, Sullivan," Garrett said, though his voice had lost some of its confident edge. "You're outnumbered, and you're on the wrong side of the law." "Maybe," Jake replied. "But I'm on the right side of what's decent." "Jake," Sarah said quietly, "let me see the contract." Jake kept his gun trained on Garrett while Sarah examined the document. Her face went pale as she read, but when she looked up, there was steel in her green eyes. "This contract is invalid," she announced, her voice carrying across the morning air with surprising strength. "What?" Garrett's composure cracked for the first time. "It's dated October 15, 1885, Sarah continued. "But Edmund signed it October 13th. That's 2 days before the date on the contract. Any fool can see the date was changed after the fact." Jake felt a surge of admiration for Sarah's quick thinking. "Sounds like fraud to me, boys. That makes this whole arrangement illegal." Garrett's face flushed with anger. "You think you're clever, don't you? Well, it doesn't matter. I've got men positioned throughout this territory. You can't run forever." "We'll see about that," Jake said. "Now, I suggest you and your friends mount up and ride out of here. Miss Mitchell has made her choice." "This isn't over, Sullivan," Garrett warned as he holstered his weapon. "I've got too much invested in this arrangement to let it go." "Then you should have chosen your business partners more carefully," Jake replied. As Garrett and his men rode away, Jake watched until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lower his weapon and turn to Sarah. "That was smart thinking about the contract," he said. "But he's right about one thing. This isn't over. He'll be back, probably with more men." Sarah nodded, her brief moment of courage giving way to the reality of their situation. "I've made things worse for you, haven't I?" "No," Jake said firmly. "You've made things clearer. Sometimes a man needs to know what he's willing to fight for." As they broke camp and prepared to move deeper into the Colorado territory, Jake found himself thinking about Martha and Tommy, about the life he'd lost and the woman he was now sworn to protect. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had a purpose beyond mere survival. But as they rode toward the uncertain safety of the mountains, neither Jake nor Sarah noticed the figure watching them from a distant ridge, or the way the morning light glinted off the barrel of a rifle as their observer tracked their movement across the vast landscape. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation with Garrett, and Jake and Sarah had pushed deep into the Colorado Rockies, following old mining trails and game paths that would be difficult for a large group to track. They'd found temporary shelter in an abandoned prospector's cabin, its stone walls and hidden location offering protection from both the elements and their pursuers. Sarah had grown stronger during their journey, her initial fear giving way to a quiet determination that impressed Jake daily. She'd learned to tend the horses, to read the weather signs, and to move silently through the forest. Most importantly, she'd begun to trust, not just Jake, but herself. "There's a settlement called Cedar Ridge about a day's ride north," Jake said, studying a hand-drawn map by the light of their small fire. "It's new, growing fast. They'd need a schoolteacher, maybe someone to help with the general store." Sarah looked up from mending a tear in her skirt. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "I've been thinking about a lot of things," Jake admitted. "About what comes next for both of us." "And what have you decided?" Jake set down the map and met her eyes. "I've decided that you're the strongest woman I've ever met, Sarah Mitchell. You've survived things that would break most people, and you've done it with grace and courage." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I had help." "You had someone who cared about you," Jake corrected. "But the strength was always yours." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind whistle through the pines outside their shelter. Over the past 2 weeks, they'd shared stories, dreams, and fears. Sarah had told him about her childhood, her parents' dreams for the farm, her love of reading and mathematics. Jake had spoken of his life before the tragedy, his plans to build a horse ranch, his hope of someday having a family again. "Jake," Sarah said quietly, "what if I don't want to go to Cedar Ridge alone?" Jake's heart skipped, but he kept his voice steady. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that these past weeks, traveling with you, feeling safe and valued and cared for, it's shown me something I thought I'd lost forever." "Sarah." "Let me finish," she interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "I know you're still grieving Martha and Tommy. I know you think you're not ready for this. But I also know that we've both been alone for too long." Jake stood and walked to the cabin's small window, looking out at the star-filled sky. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking," Sarah said, rising to stand beside him. "I'm asking you to stop running from life. To stop punishing yourself for surviving when they didn't." Jake's hands clenched at his sides. "I failed them, Sarah. I wasn't there when they needed me most." "You were working to provide for them," Sarah said gently. "You were doing what any good husband and father would do. Their deaths weren't your fault." "But if I'd been there..." "You might have died too," Sarah interrupted. "And then there'd be no one to save me, no one to show me that kindness still exists in this world." Jake turned to face her, and Sarah saw the war playing out in his eyes, the desire to hope warring with the fear of losing someone else he cared about. "I care about you, Jake," Sarah said simply. "More than I thought I could care about anyone. And I think you care about me too." Jake's defenses crumbled. "I do," he whispered. "God help me, I do." Sarah stepped closer, placing her hand on his chest. "Then don't let fear rob us of whatever this could be." Jake covered her hand with his own, feeling his heart beating steadily beneath her palm. "Martha would have liked you," he said softly. She always said that love isn't diminished by being shared, it's multiplied. Then let's multiply it, Sarah said with a gentle smile. Jake leaned down and kissed her, soft and tender, full of promise and hope. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears. "We'll go to Cedar Ridge together," Jake said. "We'll build something new, something that honors both our pasts and our future." "Together," Sarah agreed. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Jake and Sarah packed their supplies and prepared to ride toward their new life. They'd both lost families, both been broken by cruelty and loss. But they'd found something precious in each other, not just love, but the courage to hope again. The journey to Cedar Ridge would take them through beautiful but dangerous territory. There would be challenges ahead, perhaps even confrontations with Garrett and his men. But they would face them together, as partners, as chosen family. As they rode out of the mountains toward the valley below, Sarah reached over and took Jake's hand. "Do you think we'll be happy?" she asked. Jake squeezed her hand gently, looking at the woman who'd brought light back into his darkened world. "I think we'll make our own happiness," he said. "One day at a time." Behind them, the abandoned cabin stood empty once more, but it had served its purpose. It had sheltered two wounded souls while they learned to trust again, to love again, to believe in tomorrow. And ahead of them, the town of Cedar Ridge waited, ready to welcome a former cowboy and the woman he'd chosen to love, ready to become the home they'd both been searching for. In the distance, a church bell rang out across the valley, calling people to Sunday service, calling them home. The end.